very welcome. It's great to have people from all over the place. I know, and I know there are going to be people watching the recording who are in places like Melbourne, far-flung places where 4 o'clock in the afternoon for us is not a sensible time for them. So welcome to everybody. Um, I want to introduce the speakers. I'm Georgy Holden, and I'm a central academic in the design group. I lead the qualification in design now, but many years ago I was a design student, and my heroes were Nigel and Robin, who are both with me today. So I have Nigel Cross, who is, I'm sure, doesn't need much introduction to most people here. He's an emeritus professor, and he was at the OU from the inception of design at the OU. We also have Robin Roy, who's also an emeritus professor, who is still working and still producing stuff, still producing design and environmental module work. And so I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion with both of them. So perhaps Nigel, do you just want to tell us how you came to get a job at the OU? I know I've flung that one in rather, but
you certainly have. Well, it was of course the Old Boys Club. I was a student of Chris Jones's at UMIST, University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, in the mid-ish, late-ish 1960s, studying design methods and that kind of thing, but also all the other kinds of strange things that Chris Jones was teaching at the same time. And we learned a lot of very good stuff as well, like ergonomics and computing and things like that, which were novel in design in those days. And then I went to University College London, where I was a research assistant for a while after taking that MSc course there. And then there was a vacancy for a lecturer back on the course, which I applied for and was accepted for. And then quite soon afterwards, within 2 years, Chris Jones was offered this job as Professor of Design at the Open University, which I think presumably I'd never heard of before, because it was very new. It didn't start until sort of 1969 anyway. So with Chris leaving from Manchester, I obviously wanted to remain working with him, and I applied for the job at the Open University, and I managed to get it. And Robin came very soon afterwards.
yeah, Robin, do you want to tell us your trajectory? How you got there?
Well, yes, Chris Jones, who, as Nigel has said, was the first professor of design at the Open University, was my PhD supervisor at University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, and I had just about completed my PhD, but between that and coming to the OU, I worked in the US on a futures course run by Professor Waddington, who was a famous genetics professor, no longer alive. But I joined the Open University in 1971 after I think it probably was only a half an hour interview with Chris Jones and Jeff Hollister, who's the first dean of technology. And I know these days, I don't know whether I would have got the job, but in those days it was the Old Boy Network, and I joined Nigel and some others who'd been recruited.
Oh, that's fantastic! It's really interesting to know that the Old Boys Network was going strong. So what we oh gosh, Nicole, can you see that? Yes, sorry. Sorry, some people are trying to come in to a different meeting. Yeah. So the plan for today is we've got a number of points that we want to discuss. But what I asked before we as we were setting this meeting up was for Nigel and Robin to find provocations, to find things from the OU archive that we could look at and just get a flavour for the way that design teaching was back then. But I'm going to start off with launching a clip that I've chosen because as a student, this is a clip from the very first technology foundation course, and the old technology faculty had a range of disciplines which included systems and also included design. And so I came into this course as a very young student and was bowled away by the approach that was being taken. So I just want to share this clip that I've chosen because it strikes me as still being incredibly poignant today. And then we will discuss it. So I'm going to...
These film clips are examples of what I mean by design failures. They're fairly common examples of things in everyday life where the application of technology seems to be going wrong. But I don't think myself that any of the examples should be regarded as the inevitable result of technological progress. I think the failures arise from the ways in which we choose to develop our technology and from how we design the possible alternative ways of using technology. Now, it seems to me that essentially we use technology to distance ourselves from the difficulties and limitations of survival in the natural environment. And we do this by building a protective shell of technology around ourselves. And it's in doing this that we create two very problematical interfaces. One interface is between our technology and the natural environment, and one interface is between our technology and ourselves, both as individuals and as members of society. And I think that it's at these two interfaces that we are beginning to recognize these massive problems which are arising from the misuse of technology. I would say from our failure to adequately design these interfaces. So my examples of design failure are not meant to be examples of failures within technology, such as simple mechanical breakdowns. By design failures, I mean the failures to recognize and solve the interface problems. But as I said before, I don't think that any of these failures should be regarded as inevitable, even though they may be symptoms of very large problems. My own view is that whoever makes the decisions which lead to these kinds of failures, whether they are politicians or managers or engineers or you and me, whoever makes these kinds of decisions is contributing to the design of our technological interfaces. So we're all designers occasionally, because we all occasionally make decisions about how we will use our technology. And it's actually not too difficult for anyone to find examples of design failures all around them.
That we had to, for copyright reasons, we had to cut out quite a lot of news footage. So the clips that Nigel was talking about were clips of various things like the Westway urban motorway, air, car and train crashes, pollution, cars being trashed and so on. So it was really, I found that a very hard-hitting kind of challenge, really, to think about design in terms of failure rather than in terms of making. So Nigel, Robin, I'd really like to ask you, you were conveying at that time design as a kind of a political act. Was that something that was prevalent in the field at the time, or kind of where had that come from?
Shall I start, Rob?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, I think I'm not quite so sure about political, but there was certainly an awareness that technological progress was not necessarily something which was a universal good, which previously it seemed to have been, but obviously things were changing at that time. And it was in the context of the Technology Foundation course, which was a kind of radical, well, it certainly was a radical foundation course in its own right. It was a technology faculty, which might easily have been interpreted as an engineering faculty, but Jeff Hollister, who was the first dean, had a much broader view of technology than that. And many of the people who joined early on, even though so many of them were engineers and presumably committed to technology and technical change, the limits to growth report had been produced, I think, just like the year before we made the foundation course. And so there was a lot of concern about whether technological progress could continue in the way it seemed to be going, and what kind of effects it was having, both on people and on the environment, I guess. So I think that was there was a context of that we were working in. And we were, I think, in our little bits of design, which were included in the Technology Foundation course, did have something to try to contribute to that, which was about the socio-technical context of design. Rather than design as it might traditionally have been, we were putting it almost immediately into a much bigger social and technological context, and environmental, I guess, at the time. Robin?
Well, yes. When I joined the Open University in January 1971, a little while after, not very long, but a little while after Nigel, the context was the first environmental crisis. The Stockholm conference, first UN Environment Conference in Stockholm was in 1972. And then there'd been the counterculture of the 60s and early 70s. And many of the staff who joined the Open University at that time were very committed environmentalists, and some were counterculturalists as well. I mean, there's a mix of people. Obviously, there were some much more traditional engineers, as well as the people interested in the environment and radical and alternative technologies. We've had Small is Beautiful, alternative methods of building, and all sorts of things. The Technology Foundation course had Limits to Growth as one of its set books. And one of the people joining the Open University was someone called Peter Chapman, who became Jake Chapman, and he published a book called Fuels Paradise, which contained an early warning about global warming, although he thought it was due to the heat released by burning the fossil fuels rather than the greenhouse effect.
Interesting. So when you were designing the units for the first foundation course, what were the challenges and what were your intentions with that?
Shall I carry on, Nigel?
Yeah, go on, Rob. Yeah.
Well, I don't think we knew how to do it at all, really. How to teach design at a distance in a technology faculty. And we were feeling our way, really. Chris Jones, who recruited Nigel and I, and was best known for his book on design methods, in which Nigel and I were kind of steeped, he'd moved away from that, and he'd become a kind of radical educationalist, a follower of Ivan Illich. And he distrusted the OU model of teaching quite quickly, actually. And he was looking for something like peer-to-peer learning and experience-based learning, rather than a central-based system which was imparting knowledge to students. So he became kind of increasingly disenchanted with the Open University, but we were still adherents, I think, of his design methods thinking, and that was reflected in our first early teaching materials. But as I said, we didn't really know what we were doing at the beginning. And there were differences between members of the group in the early stages. I started off by producing a file of materials on the theme of what is designing, which was just giving examples of industrial engineering product and architectural design, so that the students would understand the varieties of design and what designers did in those areas. And I think Nigel produced some other material in the early first stages of T100 Technology Foundation course.
Yes, my memory of that period, it went on for at least a year, I guess, maybe getting on for 2 years, was that it was extremely difficult because we all kept trying things, but nothing ever seemed to be something which Chris Jones thought was the right sort of thing, but nobody knew what was the right sort of thing. But I think to his credit, I think, you know, what we have now 50 years later is something much more like what I think Chris Jones envisaged at the time. But the rest of us were really stuck because I remember, you know, producing drafts of material or suggestions, and then the response after various course team meetings would be from Chris was, no, that's not it. But we never really knew what it was. That's why we ended up in the foundation course being at the very end of the course, so that we had more time to try to get our act together, which we never really did, and ended up just doing 3 or 4 individual small contributions to the course, which were quite different. As Robin said, his was on what is designing, and mine was the design failures, which was actually just a poster to stick on your wall about what seemed to me to be things which we could say, well, design isn't doing very well. You know, conventional designing isn't working very well.
Although Nigel had moved away from his design methods thinking to a certain extent, he and another new lecturer produced this thing which they called Imagination and Method, and it had something, a set of cards which went along with it, which were called meta cards, which were really condensed design methods. And the idea was to actually apply these to some problems which could be design ones, but could be social problems or technological problems. So there was a little bit of the design methods even in the first Technology Foundation course. And I think then Nigel went on to produce another more conventional course document, which moved more into the mainstream design, I think.
Yes, that's true. I think, well, as I say, it did seem to be a very particularly difficult time, and it wasn't until after we kind of moved off from the foundation course, and the rest of us, I think, thought, some of us, only certainly Robin and myself, seemed to think that, well, we just got to get on and do something. You know, we can't just sit around saying, no, it's not it. That's not the right thing. We've got to do something. Otherwise, we're just wasting the facilities of the Open University. So very soon after the foundation course, we began work on the first design course, which was, I should apologize for the title, Man-Made Futures.
A sign of the time spread.
Following on from the name of the foundation, the Man-Made World. Sick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although in some ways quite apposite, since men seem to have made a lot of the decisions, but
all the wrong ones.
Yes, I'm not saying the right ones. Did you have a shared vision of what design was? Because the one thing that I think people, particularly if you're not an OU person, should know about design teaching at the OU is that it's very eclectic in the way that it looks at design. We're not teaching graphic designers or product designers. It's much broader and bigger than that. So did you have a shared or common vision? Did that emerge, do you think?
Well, I would say, I mean, you must remember the background that we just were talking about before. I mean, Robin and myself had both been students of Chris Jones, and the other person who joined very early on with us was Chris Crickmay, who was also an ex-student of Chris Jones's. So we were all kind of shaped by Chris Jones's thinking, which was much wider than design methods. In fact, I remember when he published his design methods book, he told me that, well, this is really my goodbye present to the design methods field. I've done that now. Whereas, of course, we were still thinking, oh, this is all great stuff, and this is what we thought we were going to be doing. But he had a very futures-orientated perspective. He was a kind of futurist as well as a design methodologist. And so it all began to click, really, with other people, as Robin was saying, who were in the brand new technology faculty, where there were quite a few people who had quite radical views also about what technology might be like or should be like. So there was that kind of common view. Certainly the three of us, and Chris Jones, we certainly had that background of having come through a course where we were learning the same kinds of things and talking about the same kinds of things, which were not just design methods, but also what kind of technology might be appropriate in the future.
I think there were two other aspects. One was taking a user perspective. We were taught to design from the user point of view, which wasn't very always current at that time. Chris Jones was really a pioneer in all sorts of areas, in particular in systems thinking. And of course, as well as the design group at the Open University, there was a systems group. And really, we should have got together, which we did to a certain extent, but not as much as we should have done. Chris Jones applied futures systems thinking to problems, to come up with a thinking about what the required endpoint was going to be, and then trying to work out the steps in order to get to it. For example, there was a project which he did on the future of city traffic, which envisaged automated vehicles zipping around, and he was thinking how to get from what was going on in the late 60s and early 70s to this future of automated city traffic, so really that was a systems approach to design.
I think also we shouldn't underestimate the kind of hugeness of the situation we suddenly found ourselves in at the Open University, and thinking about what design education might be, because it did certainly imply a big shift from conventional design education to something quite different, from young students working in studios to much older people, usually certainly from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, working at home. And we soon began to realize, I think, when some of the first things we tried out, we were still basing those ideas on young students in groups, in studios, in colleges, polytechnics and colleges rather than universities. And I think we really had to begin to think quite fundamentally about, well, what does this mean when you're not dealing with those kinds of students? You're dealing with a completely different set of people. They were lay people. They had jobs. They had homes. They were completely different to a normal kind of student cohort. And I think that idea of trying to form a version of design education that was appropriate for adult lay people rather than young students seeking progression into a profession. Our students presumably were never going to become professional designers, or they might, but most of them, that wasn't what their goal in life was. So it did really force us into a fundamental thinking about what kind of design education we could offer for these people.
I think we're very much focused on the principles and processes of design. And at first we started teaching about it, but I think we quite quickly went on to trying to get students to do it through various things, but in particular project work. And as Nigel said, when we produced our first design course, which was Man-Made Futures, T262, we used the design method. We had a design project guide and a design methods manual. And there was a something called PIG, a problem identification game, which got students to identify some kind of problem area which they were interested in, which they could tackle using these design methods. And Georgie got 99%.
Yeah, because I was a SWAT.
That of course, I should say straight away, that was long before we ever knew that she existed or had met her.
I know. I did get to, as I was telling colleagues earlier, I did get to make a radio program with, I can't even remember who with now, at Alexander Palace. I got invited as a student to come and talk about doing projects. So,
but just to give an example of some of the different wide variety of projects, there was most of them are kind of lost in time, but there was this is a project sampler of some of the projects, including Georgie's. One was the potential of a local carrier service for distributing goods in a small town most efficiently. And this was well before home delivery was common. So this student was trying to design a system for that. Georgie's project on self-sufficiency in the house and garden. Safety at work, reducing welding fumes, because as Nigel said, the students were in, many of the students, or most of the students were in jobs, often doing technical work. So this student was thinking of a way of reducing the fumes from welding affecting people. And then there was a kind of socio-political one, conflict between housing estate residents and a local chemical factory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we can be quite proud of that, because it was completely different from a normal design education, where the students or the whole students in a year group would, in a conventional education, would be set a design project. Your project for the next 2 months or something is to design this, and they would be given that. Whereas we, I think, quite quickly realized that our students were not going to respond very well to that, because they were involved in issues in their homes, in their jobs, in their communities, in their own lives, which they would quite well be able to devise and carry out projects for themselves, and not have to follow a set one which we gave them. I think we've never done that. We never did in the past anyway. I don't know if we do now, but
we do now.
Yes, well, I think that's one of the things. It's interestingly, funnily enough, while we were complaining about technological progress back in the 1971, 72, technological progress has actually made many of the things which, as I may have said before, Chris Jones had this vision, and then he resigned because he couldn't make the Open University work in any way that he found acceptable. But I think the technological changes in education generally, as well as in the OU, mean that a design education now can be much more like the kind of vision that I think we all perhaps had at that time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to play a clip from T262, and which, Nigel, could you tell us why you chose this particular clip?
Yes, I chose it because I quite like the way the program came together in the end. I think we had, I can't remember now, we had, I don't know, maybe 9, 10 or so programs, half-hour programs to make as part of the course. And some of them were normal kind of documentary programs. I remember doing one about a new biotechnology community in a commune in Wales. But we had this, the course finished with quite a large part of the course at the end was to do a project. And we produced project guide materials. We produced the pig game, as Robin mentioned, and the design methods manual. And one of the programs we thought we would make would be project guidance. How do you do a project in this kind of way? And so I was going to propose this program and presumably be in it. And I began thinking, well, what is it the student wants to know about how to do a project, one of these kind of open-ended projects using these design methods and the other kinds of things we'd been teaching in the course? And so I set out to write ideas down and talk to the producer about what what this program might be. And I began to realize that as I was doing this, I was actually designing a TV program about how to design something. And that was what the program came to be. It kind of followed my progress, included all kinds of things like my handwritten notes I'd made on a train going down to talk to the producer in London about it, and some of the methods from the methods manual and those kinds of things. But really, it was to be a guide for students about how to take this approach to designing something which could be anything, some of the kinds of things Robin just read out. So this one was about designing a program about how to do a design project.
Fantastic.
Now, I was actually getting a bit stuck. All this data and advice I was collecting was all about skills and not about a TV program. So I started to write some notes for the producer which said things like, this program will be about student skills and the next one can be about tutor skills. But then I thought, I'd better try to step back from all this lot, and I decided to try to make an objectives tree for the program. I thought, what can we do? We can describe the skills, we can demonstrate the skills, we can discuss the skills, and I started to question these aims and expand them and so on. I changed some, and I put them at different levels, as I tried to construct a hierarchical tree of objectives for the program. And eventually, I arrived at this final tree of objectives. Now, two new things came up as I was making those notes and constructing the objectives tree. First of all, there was a need to include something in the program about the general features of skilled behaviour. The skills of a design strategy are no different in principle to many other skills that you've already learned, such as playing music or driving a car, cooking food, speaking a foreign language, or doing your job. When you were learning those, how did you know when you were doing well? For instance, I know I'm not a skilled typist. Although I do some typing, very occasionally, I'm very slow and clumsy. Although there are some words, like design, say, that I type quite often, and so I can type them more smoothly than the rest. I'm semi-skilled, you might say. In comparison, a skilled typist types smoothly over almost all words, and can keep it up for a long time. Some of the general features of skilled behaviour are these. Firstly, the skilled person deals with larger units than the unskilled person can. Like a skilled typist will type in one movement whole words rather than single letters. Secondly, the skilled person is able to anticipate the next event. The skilled typist will expect certain words to follow others. And thirdly, the control of action becomes less conscious for the skilled person. When I type, I have to concentrate very hard on what the next letter is and whereabouts the key for it is placed. But the skilled typist is hardly aware of any need to control her movements, which is why explaining how they do it is often a difficult thing for skilled people. The other new thing that arose out of the objectives tree exercise and my puzzling over an outline for a TV program is related to the question of what to use to demonstrate these design strategy skills that I've been rather skating around. I thought perhaps I could demonstrate my own strategy for designing the program, in which case I already have my script outline.
I think that there are many things which I thought were quite good about the program. One was the way in which Colin Robinson, the producer, kind of made the program. That it actually ends. It's kind of like a loop. It ends with me saying, "I have a problem." It ends with me saying, "I have a problem," which is how to design a program. And that was the same as I began the program. I have the problem. That last clip shows how I kind of went back to the very beginning. Colin Robinson had very carefully put all this together. But I think a couple of things which are important about thinking back about it now is that one is that it was showing that design thinking can be applied much more widely than to conventional sorts of product designing, for example. This was about designing an educational TV program. It was about educational design. So I think that was, we could perhaps say now that the whole idea, the much larger view of design thinking now was there in those early days. Design thinking is something which can be applied to a much wider range of problems. And in fact, as some of these students' projects were, some of those that Robin read out before were quite clearly large innovatory kinds of thinking rather than doing conventional products. And the other was the use of design methods. Now, I know design methods very soon became kind of criticized as being too sort of rational and systematic for many people. But my thoughts were at the time that actually, if we hadn't had Chris Jones and others producing design methods, kind of instructions, guides to how you can do some of the design thinking, then we really would have been stuck about what to teach in a design course like an Open University course. That design methods did offer some kind of teachable aspects of design thinking, like the objectives tree that I use there. And the other thing which I would say is the view that design is a skill that can be learned. It's not just a natural talent that people have. It's not just intuitive. It is a high-level intellectual skill, cognitive skill, which can be developed through design education. And I think those were some very important general twinkles in our eyes at that time of what we were thinking about, what later became ideas about design as a discipline, and the whole idea of design thinking as something much more than conventional design practice.
That brings me really to ask Nigel, your book, Designly Ways of Knowing, is a very well-known book in the design world, very well respected. Did the teaching that you did at the Open University influence the book, or did the book influence your teaching? Which way round was it?
Oh no, it absolutely came out of having to face up to these problems in the OU of what is it that is going to be much more fundamental for this different kind of student audience than conventional design education. It was also partly to do with the idea of designerly ways of knowing was something which came out of studies at the Royal College of Art. Bruce Archer and his colleagues there did a project for the UK Government Department of Education about the introduction of design as a subject in general education, making design education something that was relevant to everyone, which of course was exactly what we begun to do at the Open University. So I think there was quite a lot of cross-fertilization going on between our views of design education in the Open University and in schools in the UK, where they were developing some of the old art and craft subjects into a form of design education. And it was from the RCA report that came that phrase, designerly ways of knowing. They actually started to talk about designerly ways of knowing, thinking, and acting as being equivalent to, or on the same, could be on the same educational level as thinking and ways of acting in the sciences or in the arts and humanities. And that was a way of saying design can be a third area of knowledge. And that was what led. We were also, of course, we were in something not called the design group then, but the design discipline. So we were also kind of forced to think about, well, what does this mean? Design is a discipline. How can it, many people said it's not a discipline. It might be interdisciplinary, but there's no such thing as an academic discipline called design. And of course, we had to kind of start thinking about that because we were the design discipline. And so that's what led to the idea of, well, what is it that's not an instrumental training for a design profession, but what is it that's fundamentally intrinsically valuable about learning design skills and design thinking? If it's going to be a part of general education, it has to be of intrinsic value to the young people or people of whatever age who are studying this way of thinking. And that's what led me into looking at, well, what have we learned from studying how designers design? Many of the aspects of design research at that time, what is it we've learned that we can say, actually, yes, there is something which is fundamentally important about designerly ways of knowing and thinking and acting, which does make it worthwhile to include in general education, which is what the Open University form of education was.
Well, that's so interesting. Robin, do you have anything to add about that? Or
yes, I think what Nigel said is perfectly true about the development of a broad view of design. But I think we did actually move gradually, or perhaps quite rapidly, towards more of towards the center of design as understood. In the sense that we started teaching about the various phases of a design project, user research, creative thinking, designing for production, etc. Those kind of things, which would be more recognizable as design skills, design knowledge. And from the very broad design projects of the first design course, we started moving towards more conventional tasks that designers might be asked to do, like designing we were a design discipline, but we were also at one point a design and innovation department. So it was as much about innovation as about design, from invention through design to innovation. I think much of the teaching that I got involved with was looking at the innovation process, which was the second level course was more about design. The third level modules and courses were about innovation. And maybe that's a point to introduce the provocation.
It's a very good segue into that, I think. And of course, the design degree, which in fact we didn't have named degrees at the Open University until relatively late. I think 2012, I think, is when we got the design and innovation degree. I might be wrong, maybe 2010. But yeah, I'm going to share Robin's provocation.
I thought, well, why not apply that concept to a folding bike? Instead of trying to fold it really small, make it long and thin with the wheels together at one end.
The basic concept came quite early. The next stage was to try and explore various possible structures that would give you the wheels on a stick folded form. How did you go about doing that?
Well, like the process before, I immersed myself in the problem and really tried to think of every possible way of making a structure that could fold up into a long form, thin shape. And this is where I use the sketching as a sort of dialogue with myself to try and have an idea and then sketch it, then refine it between my head and the sketchbook. And I didn't really worry about which ideas were good and which ideas were bad. I just got down as many ideas as possible at this stage to really try and cover the whole of the area.
Where did you get your ideas from?
All sorts of things, from nature, from books, from all the other ideas that have been gone before, particularly a couple of books, Bicycling Science and Archibald Sharp. The Archibald Sharp was actually written in about 1890s, and it's amazing how many ideas had already been thought of then.
Did you lie in bed thinking about possible configurations, or you just do it at your sketch pad?
All day, any day. I just had the idea in the back of my head, and ideas popped up all sorts of times.
Right, so you really need to be thinking about it hard all the time, don't you, when you're tackling a design problem?
Yes, be completely immersed in the problem.
Right. So having got all these dozens, hundreds of ideas, how did you categorise and narrow down to the forms that you eventually decided on?
What I try to do is be fairly logical about it, and so I put them into a matrix of the favourite shapes and configurations of drive and steering and things like that. And it boiled down to basically two shapes. The triangular shape and an X-type configuration. And so what I did here was to put the different drive arrangements along the different frame arrangements and check back that they all must fold into a long, thin shape. And from this, the two key ideas dropped out, and so I made wire models of them. This is the triangle, and this is the X-frame. And they both basically fold up into a long, thin shape with the wheels at one end. And they were very useful in explaining the concept to other people, and also to help refine it in my own head.
So you had to look at different drive arrangements as well as the frame configuration, because some drive arrangements would cause you problems.
Yes, for example, we can't have a chain which crosses a joint, or a belt which crosses the joint, and so some ideas were automatically thrown out.
As I said, I like to teach through examples and case studies and of real design and innovation projects. And this particular one, the design of a folding bike called the Strider, was by an engineering and industrial designer, Mark Sanders. And I think it demonstrates very, very well a systematic design process, as well as the use of various informal design methods. I mean, he drew up a specification, and he had like many designers, he looked at what existed and he didn't like what he saw in terms of folding bikes, and he had a big idea, which was this idea that the folding form should be like a stick with the wheels at the end, and he was inspired by that, by analogy with the early baby buggy. And then we saw him sketching and drawing to explore different forms, selecting form to focus on, and then the use of simple models to kind of test out the ideas. And then the case study went on to look at the development of the design, prototyping, modification, design for production, up to kind of raising finance for the project, take out a patent and all those, and marketing when he got it into production and so on. And so this was following an innovation project right through, from invention through creative thinking to production. And I used the example of bicycle design in several iterations of our second level design courses and modules. This was the one from which the first one, design processes and products. Then there was design principles and practice, this one. Then there was this one, design and designing, creativity and concept design. And then the most recent one, T217, design essentials. They all include examples of Mark Sanders's work and other work of other designers. So that was one way of teaching design, through real world examples. And then students were meant to then apply that kind of thinking, that kind of systematic approach to their own design tasks. And we did start teaching, setting the students so-called guided design exercises, rather than a big project, which we did in the early days. So they would do a guided design exercise on identifying user requirements, for example, and one on creative thinking, and then put it together in a bigger project at the end, or bigger exercise at the end.
Excellent. So
I could add a couple of things there. So, we did, as Robin said before, quite quickly in a way move on from the very broadest approach of the foundation course to design courses, which were much more like conventional courses with these kinds of guided projects and so on. And also, I think one of the things that I remember realizing at the time was that there were a lot of good things about conventional design education. For example, studio experience and kind of peer-to-peer, student-to-student discussion about designing and design activities. And another thing we did in one of the, I think the next second level course after the Man-Made Futures course was, I remember going to Leeds to the Polytechnic there to film a group of their design students tackling a project, which was actually about bicycle designs or triggered by bicycle experiences. And because I thought it was a good idea to try to convey to OU students some of this culture of designing and being a design student, rather than just letting them still be their same individual people without, and perhaps missing out on the cultural aspects, the social and cultural aspects of being in a design group. And I think from what little I know about design courses now, there is actually much more of that involved in the student activity within the courses.
Yes, and of course, I mean, when you do design a mechanical object, you need to, there is some engineering science involved as well. So we didn't pretend that we would teach the engineering science, because there are other courses and modules on that, but students had to be aware they couldn't get away without doing some calculations and knowing about materials and those aspects as well.
Yes.
And computer-aided, they're actually, although we've kind of shied away a bit from teaching computer-aided design, there was actually a computer-aided design course in the early days, and we haven't had a dedicated computer-aided design course since.
Of course,
I think that's interesting. It was a time, I think it was 1980s when we had the CAD course, because it was as though computing in design was something very new and radical, and now it's just part of normal design practice, I suppose. But at that time, it was like an extra subject to be included in the design curriculum.
And we did, of course, have it at residential school, because for quite some years we had a residential school associated with the third level, the year 3 design module, which included an option to do CAD. We do have it now in the second level module, but it's optional for students. But we have had some experiments, haven't we, Derek, with having a kind of optional summer school, online summer school, with people learning whatever software they wanted to, and that actually at a very small scale proved to be really quite successful, and is something, as we look towards the future, we're wondering how we can achieve something of that spirit, of allowing people to develop the skills that they feel that they need to. Now that brings me on really to the big question about how has the discipline of design changed over the past 50 years, or has it changed at all? And if so, what do you see the implications being for design education? Well,
I think the thing I was perhaps most pleased about really is the way that things have developed, and that what's changed is that design has indeed become a discipline. It's taken a place in academia, which it was perhaps just on the edges of back in the 1970s. And I think also it keeps coming back to me that the kind of socio-technical changes that we've seen over the last 50 years, they do take quite a long time to move from being quite radical. And computer-aided design is an example. I've commented on this before, that it took ages and ages from the very first little bits of computer-aided design, the original sketchpad of 1963, for example, before it becomes into general professional practice and becomes normal. It does take a long time. And there were pioneers like Chris Jones who saw a possibility for a kind of education and a kind of technology, which is quite like what we now have. I remember making a program for one of the technology courses, which wasn't a design course, but it was a little design contribution, and it was about the telephone system. And I remember, we had those little telephones which were those they had a particular warbling sound, and they were very lightweight, and they would kind of shift about on a shiny surface.
Trim phones.
Sorry, what was it?
Trim phones.
Trim phones, yes. But I remembered recently. I said something about it's all very well all this kind of these bits and pieces, these little changes, but what you really want in a telephone, I said, is to be able to say, just I probably said, just to speak to your secretary or something and say, could you get me Giovanni in Milan on the phone, please? And I guess I don't use voice recognition on phones, but I guess that's what you can do these days. But that was, that again was probably a program from the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And some people were thinking about what it might be possible to do. And these things have gradually become commonplace. So that's what's happened. Design innovators do have ideas about things which take quite a long time to come to more general fruition. So I think there's that to be aware of. But I do think that what we can be pleased about is that we have been very influential at the Open University in the whole idea of setting up the idea and demonstrating the idea of design as a general form of education and design as an academic discipline.
In some ways, we're coming full circle now with designers being very concerned about the climate emergency, for example. There was a Design Council 2-day event on design for the planet a couple of days ago, in which it was all about responding to the huge problems of today as designers. What can design thinking and design approaches as a kind of positive problem solving way of tackling things contribute to that. And not just climate emergency, but social deprivation, health inequalities, all those things have design approaches to addressing them. The other thing which has become very mainstream now is something we were thinking about in the late 60s and early 70s was the user-centered design. In other words, co-designing with users or observing users and finding out what their requirements are and so on. And also a whole systems approaches to designing. So required for tackling these big issues. So from being very broad and narrowing to a certain extent, I think we probably having to broaden out again.
Yes, as we move away from specialism to, we are currently trying to design a whole BDes education, and that in doing that we're trying to do it as maintaining that idea of breadth. So it's an interesting challenge for us currently. I've just looked at the time and we are approaching the end. What I would like to encourage people, we have a Padlet that we've created, which is somewhere to record people's views, some responses to the things that you've seen. But has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask, particularly ask Nigel or Robin? I think we could, there's so much that could be discussed. We could go on all night, but I'm very conscious of time. Theo, is that you wanting a question?
A quick question following Nigel's point about design discipline. I posted on the forum. I'm wondering, Nigel, what is your view on that? I mean, although the design discipline is widely recognized now, or design as a discipline is kind of widely recognized, I have the feeling that this is not really translated into design education as such, at least in UK, clearly. We are still see very much design in a very specific skills development, specific domains, and with a very specific areas for students to develop their certain skills in certain specific areas of work, rather than the principles that you were trying to establish through all this journey that you were describing, which was much broader than that, and it was much more designed as really a fundamental discipline, like science, which I'm wondering if has been translated really in UK, at least in education. What's your view on that?
Well, I think I tend to be quite positive about it. Somebody posted on a discussion forum a little while ago something about, look here, some people are writing about design thinking in all kinds of areas, and they don't even reference any of the design literature in this kind of thing. And I thought, yeah, I know, that annoys me as well. But then I thought about it, and well, actually, that's probably quite a good thing, because it does mean that other disciplines, other areas of endeavor in the world are finding that our design thinking is quite useful to them. And it's a bit, I think if we do establish design as a genuine third area of knowledge, just like science, say, on the other hand, or the arts, of course, you see other people using techniques from science, or accepting that there is a scientific way of thinking which can be extremely useful. And I'd like to think that some people now recognize that there is designerly ways of thinking which also can be quite useful in addressing a wide range of problems and issues. So I tend to be quite positive about it in general these days.
Yeah, I was referring more on the higher academic institutions and how they adopt that in their curriculum more explicitly, rather than the general movement that there is over the last more than 20 years now.
Yes, I don't really know much about conventional education and design. I do know, I know a little about architectural education, which is what I came from originally, and I find it extraordinarily difficult to understand what's going on now in architectural education.
Yeah.
I see that Rodney is asking, should designly ways of thinking be a fundamental component of nearly all degrees?
Well, I would say yes, obviously.
Indeed. Robin, any thoughts on that one? No?
So were you asking me?
Yes.
Well, I think design thinking has become current in all sorts of areas, and some designers I think are a bit miffed about it, but I think it's a good thing. I mean, it may not be completely as we would understand it, but people adapt these things to their own areas, and I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
I see Derek's got a hand up. Does that mean something?
Yes, Derek, have you got a question, please?
Yeah, it's just a kind of quick question. I suppose just quickly to respond to your point there, Robin. It is an interesting one, and it is to be welcomed, I suppose, in general. I think one of the concerns is that it's the expertise and the skills that you referred to, Nigel, in that clip that you shared. Maybe sometimes that doesn't get translated with the design thinking idea. Is that we do a few post-it notes, we do a few sketches, and that is it. It's the taking it seriously that maybe that's the business, that's what we need to do. But I've got a quick question, just a kind of a bit of I don't know, an entertaining one. There must be some weird things that you came up with that you didn't actually put into the final courses. What's your, both of you, what's your big regret? What's the big idea that you didn't get the chance to put in, and we might be able to, you know, stick it in now, 50 years later?
We might nick it.
You never know. Well, yeah, Georgie.
Ooh,
I can't think of anything at the moment. Everything went in.
Yes, we were desperate for anything. It's not quite an answer to the question. It's something a bit at a tangent, really. But I do think we learned. I mean, the pig game, which we had in the first design course, I think we did that because we genuinely thought, you know, our experience had been only with students of 18, 20, 22 years old. And certainly I knew from my small experience of teaching before that, you know, students, if you give them a project, they will go away to the coffee bar or something and just talk about everything else for a long, long time. So I think we felt that we really needed to get students a way of how to start off a project. And I think we quite soon realized that because these were not ordinary undergraduate students, young students, our students were mature people, as we've said before, with their own jobs, their own communities and so on. They had issues which they were quite happy to get stuck into straight away. Whereas before, although we said we will not give you a set project, this is your project, we did think we had to spend a lot of time encouraging them, helping them to find a project. And that was what the pig game was all about. I think we might not have, if we hadn't had the pig game, the course would still have worked quite well without it, because the students were quite able to come up with their own project ideas, which we thought we couldn't just trust them to do that straight off. That's not quite an answer to what you were asking, but that's one thing which I thought we probably didn't need to do.
Well, one thing I regret now is the loss of the residential schools, which were an experience for everyone in multiple ways. And the residential school was for the third level innovation courses, T302 innovation, and students were doing projects then, and they were inventing a new product or new service, and they came to the summer school and were able to consult with a professional patent agent if they thought they had a patentable product, and they got feedback from other students on their project idea or product ideas, and from tutors, and it was altogether a very a positive experience, which is now unfortunately lost.
Well, maybe not completely. The idea's there. The spirit of residential school lives on. Yes, we've been talking about, well, maybe we should have a design bus that goes around engaging with our students. So I think I'm going to have to call a halt to this discussion, because we've hit time and a little bit more. It's been so interesting to hear from both of you. It's I'm sure that people who are currently in the design group are going to be looking back and thinking, how can we rekindle some of the energy that was around in those early days, and build on it with the knowledge that we have now, and the experience and expertise that we have now. Yeah, there's some lovely comments in the chat. Do take some time to read them. So thank you to Nigel, thank you to Robin, and thank you to everyone that's come. We do have, of course, the usual exit form, which I'm trying to put in the chat, but for some reason doesn't seem to be copying.
While you're saying that, Georgie, I'd like to say thanks for inviting us to come on to this. And I'd also like to say that I'm actually pretty impressed with the energy of the current design group. I'm very only very remotely engaged in any of it, but it does seem to me to be a vigorous, exciting group that you've got. So good.
It is indeed. I still come to the coffee sessions sometimes.
Yeah, we've got some great people, and we continue just as has always been, people coming from different disciplines. So we've still got architects, we've got people with more of an engineering background, people with more of a graphics or interface background. So it continues to be very multidisciplinary, which is really nice. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
and
much.
don't watch out for the next event, because there will be another event in, Nick, remind me, February, is it?
Yes, that's right. So we're going to have more events like that, hopefully including more archive material, although it's sometimes a bit challenging. But yeah, so around different themes and all connected to what happened and how that might inspire the future design at the OU. So yeah, there's a little website I'm going to share with you just in the chat where you can check back in. But also when you give feedback, just let us know, and we can email you with the updates of new sessions coming in. But the next one is in February. Yes.
Thanks for inviting me, Georgie.
No, pleasure. Really, it's been great.
It was really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed that one. Thanks for coming.
So much more we could have said, but
always. Well,
thanks everybody. I'm leaving now, I think, if I can press the right button.
Yeah.
My first Zoom experience.
Thank you.
Well done. Bye.